Hello, everyone.
Oh,
So, we actually come with an additional addition this time. So, not only do we have Kurtz and Henry from last time, as well as myself, Rupert August, we bring Simon along as well. Would you like to say hello?
Hello.
Everything's much the same from the other two. So, yeah, what are we talking about today then?
right. Today we're going to be talking about state power versus individual freedom. And I feel it's going to be impossible to talk about these two things without talking about the two extremes of those positions. Fascism in the case of state power and objectivism in the case of individual freedom.
You're going to make all the ANCOMs mad.
Well, it's about time we start pissing people off, so you know.
Don't worry, we'll only piss all 5 of them off.
Bread tube's going to re. Anyway.
I forgot it's called fucking bread tube.
Anyway, okay. So how are we gonna start this?
Right. Well, I think we should probably just start off by covering the basics of what fascism is, because I can't help but notice whenever I see people speaking of it, barely anyone actually knows what they're fucking talking about.
Because they conflate it with literally Nazism and totalitarianism.
Yeah, pretty much that, and they just don't understand the basic principles of it. So I feel like it's worth just skimming over a few things, just so we're all on the same page.
Yep, sounds good.
Sounds good.
Right, alright then. So, basic principles of fascism. I'll just list them off and maybe we can have a little bit of talk about each one. Nationalism. That's a massive cornerstone of fascism. A strong sense of national identity and unity, promoted by the state. Almost always. Authoritarianism. Fascist states are pretty much always authoritarian in nature. Usually led by a dictatorship. I know Oswald Mosley of the British Union of Fascists.
The Eternal Anglo himself.
Yes, he wasn't. He wasn't looking at it in that manner, but of most of the fascist states that have come to power, they've been dictatorships, and this is particularly relevant when comparing it to something like objectivism. Is the idea of economic intervention, where the fascist state would gladly interfere with the market in order to bail companies out for, for example. And I am denied about whether including this, but capitalism. Fascist states are almost always capitalist, and I feel like it might have muddied the waters in this discussion, but yeah.
Do you want to define what you mean by capitalism in this context, then? Because that's a bit of a muddy word in itself.
Alright, okay. I suppose I mean it in just the sense of yeah, I was gonna say I've been speaking for a while now.
I mean, the way I would define the most bare basic form of capitalism is basically just something that's motivated by profit and allows for private enterprise.
Yeah, private enterprises and the idea that it's okay to have haves and have-nots, essentially.
Okay, what about this then? So the way that I would define it is through private ownership of, if you were going to use some sort of Marxist terms, private ownership of capital and the means of production.
Well,
yeah, that would be something that fascism would support.
Because that could be quite distinct from the National Socialist economy, as I understand it, for example, wherein the state owned a lot of the enterprises, but they still employed a lot of the same managers. So the people who would be considered the capitalists were still around and still being enriched by, and still had a solid amount of power, but they didn't actually own what they were working with in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem.
Would that
this
still
is
be
the problem when you?
Yeah, sorry, go on.
Sorry, this is the problem when you talk about fascism, that it's most fascist states have just varied wildly, and there haven't been as many fascist states as other forms of government. So yeah, this is precisely why I was dubious about including capitalism, but I still feel like it bears mentioning.
I suppose if it's one of these things that varies wildly, is that an intrinsic part of fascism then, or is it just something that fascist states happen to have?
That's a fair point.
So what would you say are the core beliefs of fascism?
I would say mostly the nationalism and the authoritarianism, and even the dictatorship. I'm wary of them, that there are like British fascists under Mosley. They would have been fairly democratic.
Yeah, so they were in favour of a lot more plebiscites and some other things like that. I'm trying to think of any other examples of, I guess, populist-focused fascist movements, but I can't necessarily think of any off the top of my head. I'm sure there are some. And I guess if you're listening to this and you know of any, then leave them in the comments. I'd be interested to read about them. Okay, so authoritarianism, nationalism. What else are core attributes of fascism?
I would say that those are the two main cornerstones. Then dictatorship, I was saying that pretty much every major fascist state that has held power for a significant amount of time has been a dictatorship, but there are fascist parties that never got into power, such as the British Union of Fascists that would have been more democratic. So even that is dubious, but I would still say, for the most part, fascist states are dictatorships.
So I don't know if it's something you want to add, but for me, one of the key points of fascism is the idea of the ethical state.
Go on.
So this idea that the state, using its total control, will make sure that its citizens in an ethical way, as opposed to communism, where it's more hyper focused on distributing wealth and having equality.
Yeah, so that was going to be one of my questions. Actually, is that how do you perceive that? How do you perceive the end of all this? So it's all well and good saying that we're going to be nationalistic and authoritarian, but what end is this leading in? And would you say that there's a unified perspective on that among fascists, or is that something that's more specific to each iteration?
I would say so. Potentially, the end goal of fascism, I suppose, would be a unified state with like a unified people under it that are aware of their history and their place in the world. That their state is looking out for itself first and foremost, and looking out for the good of its people above all else. It would be less focused on globalism, certainly.
To maybe interject.
Mm-hmm.
What strikes me as the end goal is obviously, as you say, it's basically the prosperity and the security of your nation and the peoples within it.
Yes, beautifully put, Simon. Thank you.
Okay. I'm sure I had some things to add earlier, but if it's eluded my mind now. So why don't we hop over to why you think individual liberty is best epitomized by objectivism, and what that means.
Right, objectivism. This is again, well, this is something that's not nearly as contentious as fascism. It's a lot more unified. Most typified in the writings of Ayn Rand.
Mm.
The sort of key points of it would be individualism. So sort of Ayn Rand's belief that of the power of an individual, that one man can overcome anything just through sheer willpower. Essentially, that it's very much a great man view of the world and history. This idea of minimal government, where the government is interfering as little as is humanly possible in individual affairs. The government exists purely to maintain its own borders with an army and maintain its laws, maintain the order of law with a police force. But other than that, doesn't interfere with people's lives. Or
it's more to act as a framework for which society can operate in.
Free market capitalism, which is just like capitalism, which we previously discussed, except without any sort of government intervention, where basically as little restriction is placed on businesses as possible. There's no bailing out of failing businesses. There's no restrictions, or at least very few restrictions placed on what can and can't be done by a business. The idea being that people will vote with their wallets, and a good business will survive, and bad businesses will die. That it's okay if there's a monopoly, because if everyone's buying one business, that must just be because it's superior to all other businesses, and the others don't have any right to exist under it.
Yeah, you raise an interesting point, which I hadn't really thought of necessarily earlier, and I suppose it's a dividing point between anarcho-capitalism and objectivism, in that anarcho-capitalism tends to dress itself up in a more populist kind of way, I've noticed. So the contention a lot of the time is that, or one of the common claims is that most monopolies and negative outcomes from business are a result of government intervention in one way or another. Therefore, if you remove government from the equation, then when it comes to monopolies exploiting their power, and when it comes to the managerial class kind of throwing their weight around and creating bad outcomes for individuals, particularly the focus is at the lower level, the populist level, then all of that will be wiped away. Whereas objectivism is kind of coming at it more from the angle of, we have these great titans of industry around, and all these great men, we should be unleashing them. And I guess it seems like there's less concern around what happens to the littler people, which is probably what makes it more of a vulgar ideology to the left in particular. But I suppose that nestles both of these kind of ways of thinking, both of these ideologies very firmly in the right, because they're both very hierarchical and in the case of objectivism, very elitist as well.
Fair. Yeah, that's all. I don't know where I'm going with this.
I mean, if I can add something to the end there, it's when you say that the left don't like this sort of ideology, it's because objectivism acknowledges sort of the inherent inequality between individuals.
No, to me, feel free to correct me, because you've read more of Ayn Rand's work than I have, Kurtz. But to me, it's almost like the anti-socialism in a certain sense, where it's not quite, but it's kind of saying that, yeah, we have all of these, we have these two categories of people. We have the great men and we have everyone else, but we should be taking the side of the great men and removing as many barriers to them achieving great things as possible.
Yeah, that's essentially what most of Ayn Rand's work boils down to, especially in the narrative side.
I guess if you wanted to get a little bit, I don't know, if you wanted to get a bit pop psychology, then that's kind of very, very much a rebellion against the socialism that she originally lived through, which is kind of interesting in and of itself. Just took the most extreme form of anti-communism that she could find, and then ran with it.
Yeah, counter ideology, as it were.
Yeah. Has everyone had their say on the free market capitalism thing?
I will add something. It's more of a tangent than an expansion on either point. But the introduction to objectivism lecture that I watched earlier had a good analogy for describing the hands-off nature of government in an objective system, by saying that a government, it's not like a managerial body or anything like that. It is a gun. So you wouldn't go and force someone to sell you bread with a gun unless you're a criminal. Like, which is where am I going with that? Basically, you wouldn't bring a gun to go shopping with you and use it to be shopping,
Unless, of course, you're an American.
unless you're an American.
Or Detroit,
Mm.
specifically Detroit.
Mm. But I thought it was a good analogy for how it is a force rather than a managerial system.
Yeah. If we're happy to wrap up that free market capitalism tangent, there's just one more point on basics of objectivism I'd like to mention, and it's this idea of selfishness, where, of course, objectivism is based around looking at individuals, and an objectivist would put themselves before all else. It would it is just selfishness in the most basic sense, that you should look out for yourself before all else, that you should put your own
look
needs
out for
before the
number
odds.
one.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I don't know how to expand upon it other than that, because it is pretty
I
simple.
think I can maybe add something to that.
Go for it.
This is because I remember this from a while back, but I did listen to a few snippets of an actual interview with Ayn Rand, and one of the things that she specifically spoke of was that she finds the idea of it's the concept of you're your brother's keeper, which is the idea that you are not only responsible for how you act in society and your morality, you're also in charge, not so much in charge, but you're also kind of responsible for the morality and the actions that your brother, or basically your fellow man, will take as well. And Ayn Rand strictly disagrees with that. She doesn't see why anyone should be responsible for anyone else's actions.
Yeah, that's a good point. That it's Ayn Rand's belief that no one is responsible for you or your actions, your successes or your failures, but yourself.
I think that
Yeah.
this latter topic is probably where the most interesting discussion is going to come out, because especially if we're going to look at it in terms of how are these two things completely incompatible with one another, the perspective on on sort of personal responsibility and one's own place in the wider society is probably where they come out as most opposed to one another. Because if we were to just talk about specifically how they manifest policies and things, then you'd probably be talking about anarcho-capitalism being the logical inverse of something more like a fascism. Because obviously it's totalizing government versus no government. But I think when it comes to how people view their position in society and how they view their responsibilities to their fellow man, then that's where they definitely that's where objectivism definitely strays from the other anarchist strains, let's say. Not that it necessarily is an anarchist strain, objectivism, but it's got a very unique perspective on the individual.
Yeah. So I think another important thing to bring up is that, as you say, it's not just no government involvement at all. Everyone does whatever the hell they want. There is a definite focus on, or at least from what I've seen, a definite focus on people being selfish, but in an ethical way. Because if you are selfish in a way that hurts people around you, it somehow is a way of damaging yourself, if not now, in the future, damaging relations or ostracizing yourself from the community, things like that.
Yeah, this is the idea of rational self-interest.
Yeah.
This is a point that you really come to understand once you read Ayn Rand's books, is this idea their selfishness always seems to lead to benefiting others. When people try to do something selfless or charitable, they always end up either generating some new law or doing something that they're actually taking the ability to achieve or the potential for greatness away from somebody else. Whereas when they do something purely selfish, they do something for their own good, then it by consequence ends up aiding others. Like in the book Atlas Shrugged, there's a huge point of a man called Hank Reardon, who owns a steel mill. He invests massively in a train line, helping them re-establish a destroyed line in Colorado, and he says it's purely because because they're buying tons of metal from him. He's making a fortune off them, and then he'll make even more money from from being able to use the train line to ship ores and stuff to his metal foundries. And he's just the only reason he's investing in them and saving their company is because it's for his own personal gain. But at the end of the day, it helps. It's aiding the people who own that train line, and then them doing well as like saving their entire train network, and it's aiding the entire economy of the country. It's everything that these characters do. It's always proclaimed to be selfish, but it always ends up helping others, even if it's just by consequence.
I mean, isn't that kind of the point of laissez-faire capitalism? The market will sort out any problem that it encounters just because people will find a way to make money off it.
Yes, but that's also primarily a matter of efficiency as well. So it will automatically generate the most efficient outcomes. But that wouldn't necessarily be to the betterment of everyone in the way that you might necessarily like. For example, so maybe you get into a situation where the greatest asset that you have as a country or as a region is in natural beauty or something that's going to attract tourism. So instead of that factory that you had that was kind of inefficient, instead that would be replaced by a thriving tourism industry, and that might make everyone a bit better off. But I don't know, maybe you could probably have an argument about how fulfilling that work is by comparison. There's not necessarily a positive or negative there in terms of like a lot of people would probably prefer to work in the tourism industry, but there are some sort of geoeconomic and geopolitical stipulations there that can take a lot more economic power out of the hands of the local people. They're kind of just at the mercy of for example, what the climate's like. If they have a bad year that year, then it's going to hit you a lot harder in the tourism industry than it is in let's say a steel mill.
Also, you're kind of going along the assumption that using your example there with a factory turning into the tourist industry is then what's exactly happening to those factory workers? Are they literally retraining to be tourist workers? And in that case, it's like how many of them will actually bother to retrain, or will you need a new workforce to actually get that to work?
The implication is that yes, you would have the same people transferring over in terms of work, but obviously they might not be too happy about the fact they've got to move into a new industry when they are accustomed to doing, to working in the steel mill, for example, or having factory work, and they might simply not want to. In which case, you would have to move in a new workforce in order to get that work done, and that just raises all sorts of other social and cultural questions about the ethical implications of that.
Okay, so Kurtz, where were you planning on going with that? Because I don't know if you wanted to do a full critique on objectivism here.
I really just wanted to introduce the two ideologies just so that we knew what we were talking about, essentially.
Okay.
I've covered everything that I wanted to in respect to both fascism and objectivism. I suppose we might as well jump into talking about how they stack up against each other, I suppose.
Yep.
Am I taking the lead on this again?
No. You,
I can throw something in if you want.
Please do.
Yeah.
It was your topic.
You didn't talk this much on your topic.
I did.
Okay, so Simon, what were your thoughts?
When it comes to like this whole basically what I consider it to be liberty versus state power is, I find myself very much wanting to follow this line of liberty and objectivism, but there are some things within objectivism itself that I just don't think are practical or reconcilable to just making a society actually function. Because one of the things that they say, one of the things that's like Ayn Rand is very particular about is this idea of, personal struggle. Like, if you are altruistic, if you help someone who is in need, you are taking away their struggle, and by doing so, you are, while you are, you claim you are doing a good deed, you are also kind of screwing them over in the long term because they are not stronger. It's kind of the whole it's the feed a man a fish or teach a man a fish situation. But I find that to be a bit morally repugnant to a degree, because it's like, okay, you don't want to help that person with their struggle, but then surely that must have a limit, because that person will not learn from their struggle if they're dead.
Yeah, that's a perfectly valid point. Again, these are ideologies I don't... Okay, I might as well out myself here. I would not consider myself to be either a fascist or an objectivist, but I would certainly consider myself to have fascist-leaning sympathies and objectivist sympathies. And the thing is that both ideologies offer elements that I find myself attracted to, but there's always something in them that turns me away just enough to where I can't fully commit to the ideology. Much like what Simon was just saying. Another thing against objectivism, the whole free market capitalism, looks good on paper. I'm behind it for the most part, but then I can't help but look at examples like the American pharmaceutical industry and how people with insulin, for example, are just bankrupted from being forced to buy a drug that they can only get from one place that has set the price up as high as it can possibly get away with, just because they know for a fact no one could. What are you going to do? Not buy your life-saving medicine?
Well, the counter-argument there would be that that's an example of state intervention, because logically, why else would, or why would they not be able to just purchase the drugs from, for example, any number of overseas companies that would charge much less, that aren't going to be price gouging them or whatever.
Or just another local company.
Yeah.
Because they wouldn't have any. Well, I assume, I don't think there's any copyright, because that's a government intervention.
Well, yeah. So patent laws and things like that would be a government introduction. So depending on the extent to which you would want to, in objectivism, preserve things like intellectual property laws, then things like that might not be a problem.
I'm pretty sure intellectual property laws still exist in objectivism, because, again, Ayn Rand's work revolves around people inventing things and using those inventions to their own personal gain. That wouldn't work if their invention could be copied and sold by someone else.
Well, there are some free market arguments against intellectual property laws, because, well, one of the arguments that I've come across is effectively that intellectual property laws, in actuality, are more like an extra tool, and a very significant tool, in the arsenal of big companies who want to use, lawfare tactics in order to take down smaller opponents. And so, in actual fact, what it does is it means that you get a vastly disproportionate advantage if you have the best lawyers around who can prove that, who can manipulate intellectual property laws to their advantage, basically, so that they can make sure that whatever logically generic good or item is in fact patentable, or vice versa, that some patentable thing is actually in the public domain already, and therefore the patent is completely irrelevant. So the actual advantages that come from innovation come from being able to lead the pack, rather than being able to enforce enforce non-competition for 25 years or however long it's going to be.
I mean, the copyright problem is very distinct anyway. Like you feel it all over the place. I mean, you only have to look at bloody Disney to understand how much copyright has been distorted since its original inception and made to, like you said, give a big company a big advantage over everybody else.
Yeah.
Because characters like Mickey Mouse and, I know this is a bit of a weird tangent, but characters like Mickey Mouse, Batman, Spider-Man, comic characters or things like that should be public domain by now, like how Sherlock Holmes is. If you were to go by the classic framework of what copyright law originally was.
So why are they not? I'm not actually familiar.
Again, I am not an expert on this, but I do know that basically these companies lobbied extensions to their copyright and have added sort of like not necessarily loopholes, but definitely a type of amendment where they can somehow, as long as they withhold their trademark on the character, they can also withhold their copyright.
I don't think we're exactly the authority on this, apparently.
No, clearly not.
I am not an authority either. I just know that basically, funny enough, through influence on the US government has then been encouraged to intervene and extend copyrights for these companies. But it seems to only really affect these companies.
Fair enough.
Yeah, that is.
So, go on.
To finish this off, to give you an idea of what I think the original framework of the copyright is, you would own the copyright. Let's just use the best example. Walt Disney created Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse is his until he dies, and then after his death, it will go on for 50 years, of which then his next of kin get the benefits, and then eventually Mickey Mouse enters public domain and anyone can use that character. But the Disney Corporation, as it were, have managed to keep a hold of their copyright. I have no idea if that's like directly through the Disney family themselves or what, because I do know that the Disney family are still around.
So I think this is going on a tangent, but from what I understood, it was 25 years from, and these numbers might be bullshit, but so 25 years from when you made the character, and then it was progressively increased to, 50 years until you die, 50 years after you die, and then it's basically meant that nothing enters public domain anymore.
Sorry, I feel like we should get away from this, otherwise when we go from talking about Mickey Mouse to fascism, it's going to be just such an absurd smash cut.
Yeah.
Not as absurd as you think, really.
Well, that was an excellent transition right there, Kurt.
Right, yes, fascism. Things that have drawn me to fascism would certainly be this idea of nationalism, of patriotism, of encouraging just a really strong sense of national identity and understanding of your people's history. And just a strong sense of patriotism that I think is a very attractive prospect in of itself. And this idea that a country would look out for its own people and its own interests above all else is something that I easily find myself getting behind. What's pushed me away from fascism is always this sense of authoritarianism. I remember thinking about this recently, seeing videos of the police dealing with people in a rather draconian manner during the coronavirus lockdown that's going on here in the UK still.
I'm mentioning that a lot.
It's super relevant. You got to mention it a lot.
Fair.
Just seeing the extent of essentially just harassing people for doing what is essentially nothing wrong, enforcing the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law. And seeing things like that makes me realize how against it I am, and then that makes me realize, like, well, that's an irreconcilable thing with fascism in of itself. Same with the apps that have been introduced in Korea and China, and that they're thinking about rolling out here in the UK. That would be such an invasion of privacy. I dislike these elements, and it's the exact kind of thing that a authoritarian fascist state would enforce.
Well, can
So
I suggest?
It sounds like
Can I suggest very quickly that there might be an additional way of looking at this, or a different way of looking at this? That, in particular, what is repugnant about the situation with the police at the moment is less that they are being authoritarian in their approach, and more that it looks very clearly as so. Because you did say that it's more of an enforcing a letter of the law rather than a spirit of the law. That it's kind of an abuse of power of sorts, not necessarily an illegal one, but like a moral abuse of power. That might be something to consider. That
Yeah, I could definitely see it from that angle.
Yeah, just a consideration, maybe.
I mean, a police force does attract like two different kinds of people: the people who want to serve and the people who desire power. And when put into this sort of situation, you can kind of see which ones are deciding to rear the more ugly side of their personalities out.
Sure.
So the thing that I was going to ask then is because it sounds like you're not really into the. I suppose it sounds like the only part of fascism that you seem to be drawn to is the nationalistic aspect, which isn't necessarily only an aspect of fascism. It is present in other. I suppose even just in isolation, not necessarily in other ideology. You can be proud of your nation and be very much pro-liberty, pro-democracy.
Yes, that's a reasonable point, but I would consider fascism to be one of the few ideologies that really puts the idea of nationalism right at the forefront and builds itself around that.
Right.
I think there's an additional way of looking at this as well, or an additional thing that is manifested by fascism that you didn't necessarily discuss earlier, I don't think, but is perhaps also a dividing line as well, in that there's a certain, in most instances, though not always, there's a certain kind of veneration of, especially, probably come to think of it, especially aesthetic fascism, perhaps even more than fascism as applied, that there's a certain veneration of kind of heroism. And that comes from both, and maybe that's one of the things, if I was to speculate, that's something you're kind of finding appealing, is in both of these cases, objectivism and fascism, they are both kind of venerating heroes. And so in that context, you wouldn't necessarily be able to go to some kind of more generic populist, nationalist, right-wing movement, because they're not quite doing the same kind of thing. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't really expecting to be sitting through a psych evaluation, but yeah, that would be a fair thing to say. This is one of the things that draws me towards fascism and away from objectivism, is this veneration of the state and of the people, more so, of your country's history, more so than anything. Objectivism's selfishness doesn't seem to leave much room for patriotism, for lack of a better term.
Well, it's
Whereas,
in a lot of ways it's strictly diametrically opposed.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Probably the most interesting, as I sort of said earlier. That's probably the most interesting thing to come out of that I would like to talk about at some point. But yeah, finish your point. Sorry, you were saying something.
I think I've said everything I want to say about that, at least, that I can formulate into coherent sentences right now, at least.
Okay, sure.
Tune in next week and we deal with Kurtz's alcoholism.
Should we talk about his childhood next?
All right.
My father never loved me.
Well, I mean, if we go by Sigmund Freud, it's very simple, and that is that Kurtz is just gay.
Aren't we all?
All right, moving swiftly onwards.
Jesus Christ, this
well-
podcast is taking some weird turns.
Yeah, let's not. Okay, so
Before we move on, can I ask Kurtz a question?
Go on.
Do you see yourself in a sort of middle ground between fascism and objectivism, or is it more like that you're running into roadblocks where they do so heavily conflict?
are you indeed a filthy centrist?
Hmm.
Oh God, I'd never want to be associating myself with that kind of person. I'd say the latter, running into roadblocks with the two ideologies and them both being opposed. I had a conversation with a friend recently where I was talking about fascism and objectivism with him, and I had ended up saying that in my view of nations, I am strongly in favor of fascism for that sense of nationalism and putting the state and the people first. But on an individual basis, I'm strongly attracted to objectivism. That I do believe in that worldview of individuals being able to overcome challenge through their own personal greatness and looking out for your own interests above all else. So I understand that they are two diametrically opposed ideologies. It's just both of them have elements that different aspects of my mind are attracted to.
Okay. So I think for me personally, and I'm coming from this from a different viewpoint. I tend to find that a lot of at least looking at that lecture I was watching earlier, the sort of core beliefs or the foundations of objectivism tend to be where I tend to view the world from, based in realism and what I can observe around me, rather than taking things on faith. Although that is starting to change, talking to Rupert. Where do you think that I suppose this is more a question for the room. Where do we think our foundations lie in terms of philosophy?
Oh,
That's-
that's a loaded question. We don't
Yeah,
know.
that's a big question, and I'm probably not even sure that I could coherently answer it.
Well,
Yeah,
okay.
we're gonna need another 5 or 6 podcasts for that.
Where do we lean more towards then? I suppose because
I don't think I need to answer that given the previous however a minute, like what, a half hour of conversation.
Oh God. Rupert, do you want to take this?
Okay, so in terms of my values, which is probably a better place to start it, I certainly value sort of. I guess in a lot of ways, I value a lot of the traditional Christian virtues and some of the various things that come out of them, except I guess with the addition of a certain kind of warrior mindset in regards to struggle being something that is inherently valuable, and I'm not intrinsically populistic, I wouldn't say, even though I would not necessarily consider myself as someone who is a born aristocrat in any particular sense. I have a great deal of respect for aristocratic ideals and aristocratic kind of mindsets. That covers quite a lot of it, to be honest. But I mean, that's to link that back into what we're actually ostensibly talking about here. That is one of the reasons that I find objectivism to be, in a certain sense, kind of aesthetically and morally repugnant, is because I cannot get behind the raw veneration of the self, even if when you get into the details, you can have conversations about rational self-interest and how that will account for everything positive in community. Just the idea that you would be seeking it purely out of your own interests and seeking to further your own aims. To me, that seems like a kind of circles within circles kind of perspective, as well as just being probably the wrong way of looking at it, to my mind. So for me, things like the So for me, individualism is a much more aristocratic kind of impulse, and that needs to come out of the national milieu in a certain sense. So you have the kind of collective community which gives context to everyone that exists within that nation, and then out of that you can have certain individuals, perhaps even most individuals, that are able to exercise some kind of unique perspective within that national context. And so I suppose, to again bring it back around, that's why I don't necessarily see these two things as perhaps inherently in competition with one another, because at a certain level they will be, but I think you need that kind of through lack of a better term, kind of in this context, fascistic impulse, and the things that fascism promises kind of need to be present in order to generate strong aristocratic individuals. And some of those great men who can kind of strive to do great things with I don't know, do they do such things entirely on a self-centered basis? I would say ideally they probably wouldn't. So I'm a big fan of duty as well. So this is kind of meandering back to your question, but yeah. So duty is something that I think ought to be instilled, particularly in aristocratically minded people. And so perhaps I do lean more towards the or more away from the individualist side. But I think, yeah, to go back to the original point, I think that the individual needs to be, or rather is in reality, and we need to bear in mind that it arises out of a collective, and therefore you need to protect the collective first.
Yeah.
A little bit meandery and perhaps rambly, but yeah, hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah. Okay. So this might be going back to a critique of objectivism, which would be fine. I don't know. But so one of the issues I have with it, and I suppose it brings it back more towards the individualism versus communal thinking. I can't remember how we phrased it earlier. But what? Collectivist. Yeah. But so something that apparently Ayn Rand said, I didn't hear her say it, but she was saying that you aren't born with a specific ideology in mind, or you can't be forced to learn it. You choose to learn the ideology of your surrounding, which I suppose in a way is true, but I don't know. The issue that I have with it is that how much are you choosing when you're 5 and end up needing to go to public school? How much are you choosing to, as a 5-year-old child, to believe or disbelieve what everyone around you is saying and believing? It's a bit of a...
I mean, I don't even get past the first hurdle on that, because I do think there are certain sort of genetic ideas, I suppose. I mean, to give a kind of biological basis, I suppose, to what I was talking about with regards to individuals coming out of a collective, the kind of collectivist, the social technologies that we experience, hierarchy, for example. Hierarchy as a social phenomenon predates the existence of humans. Therefore,
Top lobster.
Yeah, top lobster. Therefore, how surely those things must be have some kind of quality that transcends human as a rational blank slate kind of animal.
I suppose, but I wouldn't say that anyone is a blank slate.
Well, no, but that's the implicit claim, right? That Ayn Rand was making there, though, right? That we are choosing to take on the ideas of our surroundings.
I'm not sure. The example given was Anne Rand herself, given that she grew up in the Soviet Union and then became something so far removed from it, a bit extreme.
I mean, I wouldn't even necessarily say that was a kind of rational thing in and of itself, because as we said earlier, to me it rings very true of, especially considering the absolute opposite personal ethics that are instilled by objectivism versus socialism of the Soviet Union. It's more just she had a quality of rebelliousness which was in her, or maybe even intellectual rebelliousness or intellectual curiosity that led her to turn as far away from what she was being taught as possible. That's not her making a rational, inquiry to find the best method of living one's life. That's very firmly rooted in the milieu of which in which she was brought up. Do you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. And I don't disagree with you. I think that's a good point.
Yeah, I'd also say I agree with what Rupert was just saying. Yeah. Yeah, another strike against objectivism, I suppose. Something else that I did want to say. I feel like we've sort of passed it now, but I don't. I think if I don't say it now, we won't get around to saying it at any point. Is there certain dissonance that I find with my own thoughts, which is on the view of the individual that I'm looking at things from the standpoint of an objectivist, of individualism, of selfishness, and yet looking at things from a more fascist standpoint, wanting a nation that is of a united people, with a united sense of self about them, and these ideas of sort of this idyllic sort of fascist depiction of a community of sort of tight-knit people who are all understand that they're part of this same sort of community and lineage. It's one of those things that just doesn't quite match up again.
Doesn't match up with what we see in the real world, or with your personal views?
With individualism and fascism,
Right.
I just laid it out.
No, sorry, I was misunderstanding you. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't. Sorry, no, I'm thinking. So I don't know if. So this is, I suppose, a question for you. It is objectivism. Is that excluding the idea of you having a community and doing things for each other, or is it because from what I understand about it, it's more you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, which is more of a sense of community built than we have, I suppose, at the moment, where the government comes down from above and gives you everything you need, or redistributes the wealth around, or what have you. So I would have said that objectivism would instill, just in the values of it, instill more of a sense of community. But maybe I'm wrong. You tell me.
I would never describe objectivism as I scratch your back, you scratch mine. I'd describe it more as step on as many toes and slit as many throats as you need to reach the top. That's where I would take that. That's how I interpret it, and that is to an extent with the individualism of objectivism. It doesn't mean that you only exclusively look out for yourself. There are characters in Ayn Rand's books who they they make sure that the people around them, that their loved ones, are happy. But even that comes round to a selfish end goal of they want their loved ones to be happy because seeing them happy makes them happy. So in a sense, they're doing even that for themselves. And I don't think that that's necessarily good for fostering a strong sense of community and unity in a people.
I feel when it comes to where I think this is my own like kind of tick against not tick but mark against objectivism is just the fact that the whole idea of selfishness, and then like I said, you're only meant to be responsible for yourself and all that. But then because you're only responsible for yourself, you're not responsible for anyone else. No one should be responsible for you. And yet humans are just any human, it doesn't really matter where you come from, is completely capable of very self-destructive behavior. And as much as you can try to tell them they need to take responsibility for themselves, chances are they won't. And so, and again, I feel like that does not help towards making a healthy community, because a healthy community is someone who will see, a healthy community is one that will see members of its community struggle and try to figure out how to not necessarily, help them to the point where they are dependent on the community, but at least help them enough to where they can get more on track. But that requires people feeling responsible somewhat for the well-being of each other.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so I will add for the viewers that I am coming at this entirely from a lecture by an associate of Ayn Rand. Sure. Yes.
I'll have you know I've read most of Atlas Shrugged and played Bioshock through to completion at least once.
Yeah. So I don't know, maybe I'm misunderstanding it. Maybe the person that I'm getting this from is misunderstanding Ayn Rand. I don't know.
Well, you could look at it. So one thing that came to mind to me a little bit ago when you were explaining, when we were talking about the culture angle, is that it depends very much on what your perspective is on culture formation and culture maintenance. Because if you have a perspective that suggests that culture is a very bottom-up phenomenon, then it wouldn't necessarily change too much to have an objectivist versus a, say, liberal democratic kind of culture, because the people are fundamentally going to stay the same. It's just you're unleashing the ability of the greatest among them to be able to achieve great things. And for everyone else, they would still be operating under the same kind of cultural framework. But if you view culture as more of a top-down phenomenon, where you have the aristocrats and rulers of society kind of setting the fashions and setting the trends that everybody else is going to follow, then it's going to look a lot more bleak. And that would be where an argument for fascism comes in, because you can ensure that the best people are the ones who are going to be, sending the signals to everyone else, and thus we can all start to work in more productive ways that are going to be less, internally damaging, and etc. etc.
Yeah, I would like to believe that culture is bottom up, but then considering, and I know don't mean to tangent here, but it's like how Japan for the longest time adopted a lot of the cultural foibles of China. So that gives me, and that's all about what the Chinese aristocratic elite were doing that then influenced what the Japanese aristocratic elite were doing. So as much as I'm here being like, oh yeah, culture is totally bottom up, I've seen way too many examples of it being top down.
Yeah, well, I know for a fact that you, Henry, have read Moldbug, or read some Moldbug at least. So yeah, he makes a very strong case for culture being incredibly top down, insofar as the trends and the fashions are set by power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so the thing that I was the examples that I was thinking, I don't know if they apply, but with the Norman conquest, vastly influenced culture across the country even to this day, just by having that aristocracy coming from Normandy.
Yeah. But it wasn't. But I mean, okay, if we were to take that example, it of course wasn't entirely influenced by Norman culture. Otherwise, we'd all be speaking French now. So too. Well, I mean, I guess how much stock can you really put on this as a phenomenon? I don't know, but it's probably more noteworthy that most people, in my personal observation, associate more closely with the Anglo-Saxons than with the Normans.
Well, I was just saying they had a big influence, not that was because there obviously was an established culture there, and then the Normans came in and had an influence of it, rather than the Normans come in and instantly all the culture in the British Isles is wiped out.
Yeah.
So like a weird, not necessarily an assimilation, but a sort of convergence, I suppose, of two cultures.
Well, that was very, very definitely the project itself of Edward III. Because he wanted a more unified knightly sort of class who could be distinct from France in order that he could use them to conquer France. So I guess that comes back to the argument of, okay, well, the culture that we have and the view of ourselves as distinctly English is perhaps also a project of power.
And also a top-down phenomenon.
Yeah, that's what I mean, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, that doesn't make me feel comfortable at all.
So we've been going for about an hour now, so does anyone have any closing remarks or anything we want to talk about quickly before we head off?
I'd just like to take this moment to bring up a few things I had noted down. Because I was kind of hoping these would crop up in conversation naturally, but they haven't. And I'm just going to go ahead and defend fascism for a little bit. Because right now, I think I've spent the last hour securing my place as one of the least likable people on the internet. So, first of all, fascism is all too often conflated with Nazism. The Nazis were fascists, but not all fascists are Nazis. It's really, it's just as simple as that. Really, the Nazis were built their ideology around hating others and genocide, solving that through genocide, and an expansionist philosophy that was shared by fascist Italy. And a fascist state wouldn't necessarily have to follow those. I say necessarily that as if it would be a niche scenario. It definitely wouldn't have to. A fascist state could be entirely inward-looking, care only about its own borders and its own people without having to make any excuses or use the ideology as a reason to go to war. It's just something that is not necessarily part of the ideology. And on expansionism, on the race hatred thing, is again having a strong love for one's own culture, one's own history, does not mean that the culture would be around would be based around hating other cultures and other nationalities.
Well,
saying these aloud, I feel like they seem pretty obvious, but
then let me propose an additional word for you then, given to me by the late Roger Scruton. He proposed that because I guess nationalism gets so often conflated with xenophobia, what we should really be looking at is the positive side of things, which is actually why most people rally to nationalism in the first place, is not because we hate the other, but because we love what we have. And thus, instead of being xenophobic, we should perhaps be, considering ourselves more in the context of an oikophilia, or having oikophilia, which is love of home. So roughly how it directly translates in Greek.
Thank you, Rupert. Much better put than I was managing.
It's quite okay. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you. Carry on. If you had anything else to add.
That was really everything I wanted to say. I just wanted to slip those in at the last moment, before one of the viewers calls me a Nazi in the comment section. I am not.
All right. Anybody else got any final remarks? I think I've basically covered everything that I intended to.
Yeah, basically.
Simon?
I mean, I always have a lot of remarks, but they should probably be best saved for another time.
I'll give us one.
Okay. The only thing that I can really think of when it comes, because I'm thinking back to the original question, which to my mind was basically state power versus liberty, is if we just assume that state power is made up of, because in my mind state power is made up of aristocrats of some kind. Is that a fair assumption to make?
Oh, wait, say that again, sorry?
That state power is basically the aristocrats, more or less, of some kind.
I mean, they would de facto be an aristocracy, whoever's controlling it. You know, what with...
Okay,
Yeah.
And so this is sort of where I kind of get where the whole liberty versus state power thing, I think, is that liberty is, and I know this is where I'm like, I'm a libertarian, guys, honest, is basically where liberty works if everyone is kind of on the same page, is willing to take the same level of responsibility, and this is going to really tar me with bad brush, but all be relatively the same level of educated and aware of what's going around them politically. So that's why sometimes, as much as I want to really lean hard on individualism, and while I'm not fully going into objectivism, because like I said, there are things about it that I find morally distasteful, I do sometimes think that the whole idea of everyone having a say, everyone being able to operate their liberty as much as they desire, runs into issues when you have to try and make people be responsible to their society and nation as a whole, because if you're not responsible for yourself, then your community, well, if you're not responsible for anything, be it yourself or anyone else, your community starts to fall apart, your society starts to dysfunction really badly, and then that's kind of your nation gone.
Yeah. Well, so we name dropped him earlier, so that's one of Moldbug's points, where, so politics has become a bad word. People don't tend to like talking politics. And politics being a very key part of democracy, being able to voice your own views, influence, not necessarily influence, but like talk about to your friends at least which way you're voting, things like that.
Yeah, and so my issue then, why it becomes a bit idealistic, and maybe why even nowadays you can kind of see how it's kind of not working, because you have people who are just willing to completely switch themselves off from it, and it's like you do require everyone have some base level of political awareness that I don't think we're even remotely hitting.
People making a decision without really caring what the outcome is.
Yeah, so it's
automatically.
So again, as much as I want to be all like, yeah, I'm a libertarian, guys, woo, it's like, yeah, but there are some things that seem a bit idealistic, and that's why, to maybe go back to also how Kurtz was feeling, I too get that kind of way, although maybe I do lean more to the libertarian side than he does. But at the end of the day, there is a lot of things in fascism that are actually quite tantalizing almost.
Okay.
That's just my final remark, is I do think even nowadays we do, if you are going to be pro-liberty, then you really need to have a good think about what is the base responsibility of every citizen.
Ooh, responsibility. Dangerous word in libertarian circles.
So, very quickly, potentially something we should have done at the start, where do people feel like they lean more towards, collectivism or individualism? Because I personally am more of a
I think you cut out there briefly. Say that again, sorry.
Sorry, I personally am a bit more of a collectivist. What about everyone else?
Yeah, I definitely, I would definitely fit more on the collectivist side. I think in different scenarios, in a different situation, I might be slightly different. So if I felt like the collective was less imperiled, then I might be more of an, I might think that individualism would be a bit more appropriate for the times. But yeah, certainly for now, I'm quite firmly on the collectivist side.
I feel like we've spent a lot more time talking about objectivism than we have fascism. I genuinely don't know. I flip between the two of them constantly, just thinking about it. I want to say I lean more towards collectivism than individualism, but I'm sure if you ask me this this time next week, I'll have a different answer for you. It's something that I continue to struggle with personally.
Sounds like dirty centrist talk to me.
No. I flipped from one extreme to the other, I swear.
Simon?
Good grief! You're like you're a red. You're just red blue all over the place. Well, I guess I'm going to be just the complete contrarian here and say that I am still very much lean more heavily towards individualism than I do collectivism. Because I don't know, maybe I'm just optimistic, maybe I'm an idealist, or maybe I just literally look at objectivism, take out the things I don't like, and just stick with it. I don't know. I don't really have a clear answer other than I like individualism.
Fair enough.
Well, on that happy note then, everyone except Simon. See you all in the Ayn Randian labour camps and re-education camps. The future objectivist totalitarian state.
Don't worry, I'll be right there. I'll be the warden.
All right. Bye then, everyone.